Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the 2022 NATO Youth Summit. I know that was a short break, so thank you all for bearing with us. I promise our next one will be longer. But it's so good to have you all back in. For those of you who might just be joining us at home, I am your host for today, Lawrence Baranza from SIPA. So earlier today, we had a bunch of great conversations already about how NATO is adapting to incorporate the priorities of young people like all of you. And I know one issue that so many of us care about quite a lot is climate change. And so I'm so thrilled that we have a session totally dedicated to this topic, which is really important. We have a fantastic panel of experts, both young activists, which we're so thrilled to have with us, but also institutional reps to talk about how we're both making differences in our own communities, but also organizationally tackling the security implications of climate change. So thank you so much, especially to our chair of this session, Jeff Goodell, who is such an expert in his own right. He's an American author and a contributing editor to Rolling Stone magazine on environmental and energy issues. Jeff, it's so great to have someone like you driving this debate and guiding us through these tough questions. It's such a privilege to have you. I'll just remind everyone once more to continue to send your questions in through the app so that Jeff can keep working those into his discussion. And with that, let's kick off our discussion on climate. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that introduction. What a timely subject to talk about today, given what's going on in our world. I want to start just by framing the conversation with a story about my first kind of awakening to the risk, to the urgency of the climate crisis in the context of national security. And that was in 2016. I was visiting Norfolk Naval Base with then Secretary of State John Kerry. And we were touring the base, and the commander of the base came up to Secretary Kerry while I was standing there and said that due to rising seas, this base was going to have to be moved within the next 30 or 40 years. And the implications of that are so astonishing and so huge and so kind of mind-blowing that it really gives you a sense of kind of what we're talking about here, which is, you know, this is the largest naval base in the world, and the idea of having to actually move it due to rising seas is something that is going to change everything about American security, about how we think about force deployment. And it really opened my eyes to sort of the sort of big picture risks that we're talking about here, both on the climate impact side, as well as on the sort of military and force deployment side. And so now we have the war in Ukraine, which is obviously the subject of the day. It is obviously not a climate war per se, but fossil fuels and decarbonization are at the center of the debate about how we're responding to that, about our dependence on fossil fuels. This is all stuff that I would love to talk about today. I have a great panel to talk about these issues. I have Neeshad Shafi, from the co-founder of the Arab Youth Climate Movement, Qatar. Alexandria Villaseñor, the founder of Earth Uprising, who is there with you. Lucky Alexandria. Jill Duggan, the Executive Director for Europe for Environmental Defense Fund, joining us from London. And James Appathurai, the Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. So I want to ask each of you sort of one question to start off the conversation. And James, I'd like to start with you. Explain to us what the role is for NATO in thinking about climate security. I mean, climate security is an issue that is mostly considered, dealt with by nations, by governments. What role does NATO have in thinking about this?
So thanks very much for that question, and it's great to be here. And I think 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to give you much of an answer because NATO wasn't actually paying much attention to the security implications of climate change. We had references to it in our documents, but frankly, there wasn't that much work going on. And it's all really changed. And actually, when I went, I used to do all sorts of things at NATO. I've been at NATO longer than she's been alive. And I was the NATO spokesman, and I used to negotiate with the Russians. But when I went home and said that I was going to be working on the security implications of climate change, my son said, "Finally, you're doing something useful." And I could see from his point of view, why that was really the case. And I think that NATO, more broadly, has really come to grips with the fact that climate change is going to affect security, and we need to adapt to that. So the first thing is that we need to understand what's happening, and NATO's now focusing on that. And I think all of us know, in broad strokes, what the security implications of climate change are. And you just mentioned one of them, what's going to happen to the coasts, a lot more disasters and extreme weather. The Arctic is going to be opening up because the ice is melting. It's going to be more conflicts over resources, more extreme temperatures. We could go on and on. So first, we need to understand what the implications are, so we're studying that. Second thing is, we have to adapt our forces to that. Meaning, for example, in my country, Canada, when I was at the Defense Department, we very rarely had a soldier working inside the country on disaster relief. Like once we had an ice storm, because that's what we have in Canada. But now it's all the time. Floods, fires, that's true in all the NATO countries. So they're going to have to do more of that. We need equipment that can operate in heat and in cold. More extreme than it was, and that means buying it now so that you have it later. We need to, of course, adapt all our coastal facilities. Need to be able to operate up in the Arctic. So we need an adaptation process. It needs to start now. It needed to start yesterday. And then the final thing we need to do is contribute to reducing carbon emissions. So we need to get to our facilities, see if we can reduce what our bases emit, need to be more efficient for our forces, both to reduce their requirement to have, fuel, but also to see if we can't reduce the burn from our forces. So these are all the reasons why NATO is turning to this. In the Madrid summit, you'll see a real focus on that.
Thanks, James. So Alexandria, let me ask you, you work with a lot of young climate activists, and I'm very in touch with them also as part of my job as a journalist. Climate security is not high on the sort of agenda and awareness of people that I talk to here in the U.S. Tell me about how this is perceived and sort of playing with the activists that you work with.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, climate change is such a big issue to my generation. And I think that it's because every aspect of our life is going to be impacted by the climate crisis, from where we go to school to what kind of jobs we have. A lot of young people are even having conversations about whether or not they want to have children because of climate change. And so I'm 16, and I'm already thinking about kind of how every aspect of my life will be different. And so it's such an important issue to us, but then also there's such an important aspect of the security reasons. First of all, climate change is, threatening our resources and our planet's resources, and that is really going to be a big issue when it comes to a threat on security all around the world, because there's going to be, our life support systems that are going to fail. And so because of that, that will lead to conflict. And so there's a lot of young people, especially in countries who are most affected by the climate crisis, who contributed the least to it. And those are the ones whose voices really need to be heard, especially because of the fact that they aren't really being included in a lot of the discussions. And so those are the ones that are going to be impacted the most. And they don't really have the safety and support from countries all around the world. And so it's a big issue to young people, and that's why we're continuing to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks. Neeshad, you obviously work with a lot of climate activists in the Middle East. Perspective there, I'm sure, is very different And we don't hear a lot of, at least here in the US, and presumably in Europe also, about the perspective of activists there. I'm interested in just your broad outlines of how this question of climate security and the implications of that are playing among the activists you work with.
Well, thank you, Jeff, to bring up that. Of course, the youth activism from the region has been not quite known in any part of the world. Of course, the region itself is going through a lot. Well, now we talk about energy and climate just because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the region has been always under invasion. Either it's from Iraq, the Kuwait invasion of Iraq, and we have issues, Israeli-Palestinian issue, we have Syria, we had Iraq war, we had the latest one in Yemen. All this contribute to make climate change at the least discussed topic in much of the government level, at least. It also transcends to the young people too, because if you are in a war-torn country, the biggest thing you look at is the safety of your family, food on the table, employment. So climate change doesn't climb up the stairs. But the climate change has severe security issues here. It starts from Syria, when many of the studies do indicate the whole Syrian conflict has to do with the farmers, and the farming sector had critically impacted due to the worst drought they've gone through. A similar thing has been now continuing in many of the war-torn countries like Yemen, for example. It is almost in a catastrophic position. The food security at the worst. The climate change would be exacerbating the existing situation to lead a lot of young people to extremism. This is a critical point, which is not seen by the governments or our international partners. So over the years, and also with the impacts of climate change, the Middle East and North Africa is one of the worst and most vulnerable region in the world. Does that translated into action? To some extent, no. Does this dangerous level of climate change impacts has been taken into discussions? No. Also, given the fact, potential such war zone areas being point to be a breeding ground for terrorism and extremism, which is quite frightening to a lot of young people in the region. This is the problem. So when you don't have the young people given the platform, like Jeff mentioned, where are these young people in the region? If they are not given the right platform to share what's happening in their part of the world, I think people our Western allies or else are blindfolding towards us. So in a way, the extremism or counterterrorism point should look climate, because at this point, the climate change would make things very difficult in our part of the world, which is already going through our worst, through war, or within the terms of climate, because we are already very vulnerable region, a very water scarce region. It also has resource issues, even food or water. And most of the North African countries are going through civil wars. So the climate change would be only making it difficult. So if you don't have the right strategy, things would be really out of hand in this part of the world.
That's a very, very great point, I think, and the risks of extremism. So Jill, I want to ask you about the war right now. One of the things that's happening here is this question of well, we're going through a transition, right? We're getting off fossil fuels. You've worked very hard, and Environmental Defense Fund has worked very hard trying to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, which are, of course, the reason that we're talking about these climate impacts. And we seem to be at this sort of balance point right now where we're seeing fossil fuel industry kind of resurging, our dependence upon fossil fuels becoming more urgent. And at the same time, it's a great opportunity to move away. And we're seeing that, the leverage that Russia has over Europe right now is due to, of course, fossil fuels. Zelensky said this morning, just before this conversation started, I logged on and saw that he said Putin is using oil and gas as a weapon. How are you seeing this playing out as far as the larger challenge of decarbonizing our energy systems off of fossil fuels?
Well, obviously, the quicker we can transition away from fossil fuels, the less dependent we are on autocrats who use them as a weapon. And of course, one of the things that we're seeing in Europe and the United States and elsewhere is as energy prices are rising post-pandemic, not all due to the war in Ukraine, but exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, there is talk about should we be drilling for more oil or using more gas, or what should we be doing? And obviously, in the short term, there is going to be a need for diversification of resources, particularly in Europe, away from the dependence on Russian oil and gas. But at the same time, we need to be ensuring that we're accelerating this transition. Otherwise, we just make the situation worse for ourselves. And you can see that as you see leaders around the world who, in an effort to move away from Russian oil and gas, go to a variety of other countries, and not all of them look like, you know, your best future friend, really. It's sometimes moving a problem from one place to another. And the only way to really deal with that in the medium term, and it's very difficult to do it in the short term, but offshore wind and wind resources can be got up very quickly in certain circumstances, is to move to renewables. Renewables are less attractive to autocrats. They don't give huge amounts of wealth because we can't kind of capture the sun and the wind as personal resources in the same way that we can oil and gas reserves. They tend to be available in some measure if we give the right technologies, and that is a question for developed countries to ensure that the technologies are available globally for all countries to be able to use these resources. But at this particular moment, I think we've got to recognize that there'll be some difficult short-term choices about where oil and gas come from and the need to, you know, bolster our resilience in the next year. But we should deeply resist any investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, because we really need to see this as an opportunity to move away from fossil fuels, but also from that sort of dependence on autocrats and unstable states and unfriendly states, and ensure that globally we see this as a big push to ensure that all countries have increased access to renewable resources.
That's great. Thanks, Jill. So James, I'd like to follow up with you on this. You know, you talked in the beginning about, you know, the sort of NATO's awakening to the risks, to climate risk. How specifically would you say what's happening right now in our world with the war and all the things that Jill just talked about, this urgency of the transition, but more broadly, how is it waking people up to climate risks? I mean, I know that you obviously cannot divorce the sort of resource war aspect of what's happening now with climate risk, but is this a changing, is this a transition moment for not just our dependence on fossil fuel, but our dependence, entering into this new world that we're obviously doing very quickly of changing security risks from a rapidly warming world?
I mean, that's a great question. I'd say a couple of things. One is, I think until 3 or 4 years ago, climate was always sort of in the background, the security implications of climate change. It was in the background. It was something we could get to if there was kind of nothing else going on that day. I think what's different now here is that the current international security context includes climate. In other words, it's still a priority. It's always a priority. So the word crisis, you know, we deal with crises here at NATO, but climate has moved on to that list. So as we prepare for the Madrid summit, the ambassadors here are about to start negotiating what we call the strategic concept, which is our guiding document for the next 10 years. And if there's one thing they all agree on, and it's kind of only one thing right now, maybe a couple more, it's the importance of climate. And that will be prominently in the document. And that means our military structures, our political structures are all going to have our marching orders to keep this very high on the agenda, no matter what's happening in the security sphere. Second thing I would say is every one of our governments on a national basis is wrestling with this. Like, they're all deploying their forces to deal with these problems now. They're all facing the health problems, the security problems, the food problems. So it's not going to disappear from our agenda. It's going to remain important. The third thing I would say, building on what we just heard about Russia, is it's absolutely right that we need to take this opportunity. You know, there's an expression, never waste a crisis. And this crisis with Russia is an opportunity to pivot away, not just from dependence on Russian oil and gas, but to invest more quickly in renewables. there is a challenge to increase the amount of renewables that we're putting on stream, and we've just literally been discussing that 20 minutes ago over across the street here. But I would add also that we need to keep our eyes open precisely along those lines about creating new strategic dependencies. Right now, renewables are heavily dependent on certain materials like rare earths, where we actually in the West and the democracies don't control the supply or the processing almost at all. And to be very open with you, China owns the materials and in particular the processing facilities. We don't want to create new strategic dependencies. So this is another complication as we look forward to doing this. But in the end, we will have to include renewables as a greater part of the mix. It has become more urgent as a result of the Ukraine crisis. But the overall adaptation of our forces that I just outlined to you, based on an assessment contributing to net zero, that's going to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah, right. As a friend of mine who writes about climate change often says, in this world, speed is everything. And I think that's very true, the urgency of this transition. Just a quick note to the audience, please submit any questions you have. I see a few that are coming up here. I'm happy to ask our panelists about them. I want to ask Alexandria one thing. Alexandria, you mentioned in your first comments about the sort of overwhelmingness of the climate crisis, especially for a lot of young activists and young people in general. And I think that's very true, obviously. And there's a lot of concern about that in the sense of is it too late? How screwed are we? And in certain ways, I would think that, I wonder how you think about that in the context of this war. Is this something that you see as contributing to that sense of, oh my God, our world is in chaos and what the hell, I'm gonna, go to the beach and, just try to forget about it all? Or do you see this as a, moment of, how do you turn this into a moment of engagement, of getting people activated to really understand what's at risk here?
Mm-hmm. I think that there are definitely a lot of young people who are feeling overwhelmed by everything, especially because we are seeing more climate fuel disasters. And I live in California, and we're having more wildfires every single year. So it's hard to ignore climate change when it's literally outside of your doorstep and you're seeing it. And you're seeing these climate fuel disasters happening. And so I think that when it comes to what is happening in Ukraine, I think that a lot of young people are feeling overwhelmed because they see it as something that climate change is fueling itself as well, because it is a kind of a war on resources. And so Russia is going after Ukraine's energy grid. And as well, there's an area in Ukraine that is especially being targeted that is a coal mine. And so, there are more conflicts that are going to arise when it comes to resources and certain countries trying to get their hands on coal or oil and gas. And so because of that, I think that there's a lot of young people that are feeling the need to put pressure on their governments to start getting off of coal, oil, and gas, and start focusing on renewable energy. And I know we were discussing this as well. And so I think that this is a very real opportunity that we have to start focusing on renewable energy, because the more that we start ramping up oil and gas in response to what is happening in Russia and in the United States as well. Right now, Biden is starting to ramp up this coal and oil and gas to become more independent. But that is the wrong thing that we are doing. We need to start focusing more on renewable energy and starting to focus on being sustainable for the long term, because when we have that focus on renewable energy, greenhouse gas emissions will start to go down, and that's what we really need to focus on, is lowering our global greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that this is an opportunity, and I think a lot of other young people see that too. And so we're starting to come together and really put pressure on our own countries, but then also focusing on supporting those in Ukraine and in the youth climate movement, we focus a lot on mutual aid. And I think that when it comes to what is happening right now, mutual aid is such an important aspect of this.
Yeah, yeah. I think in a certain way, you could make the argument that in a terrible way that Putin is a pretty excellent advocate for the urgency of decarbonization, because this war is making clear exactly what's at stake. Neeshad, I want to ask you about something you mentioned before, which is the risk of extremism among activists and things. That's a very interesting idea that we don't hear a lot about in the West, at least in the US. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, definitely. See, so we are already in, as I mentioned, the current climate change is already exacerbating the fragility of some of the countries, which are already in conflict or undergoing or post-conflict transition. And there is a struggling bunch of young people, who has a growing population, and the Middle East and North Africa has the highest young people who are below the age of 30. And this growing number of young people who doesn't have any jobs, decreasing or volatile oil prices, and some of the weak governance, and the latest the fallout of pandemic is making them so vulnerable that this whole issue contributes to the proliferation of armed groups and intensifies conflicts over natural resources, and make it easier for the extremist organizations to attract young people as their recruits. So to address this, definitely the government must approach the climate change as a public policy issue and see that the threat or the interconnection of how these challenges can combine together in a way that they can make sure that the young people, future has been taken care. So fragility and the current crisis is making it more difficult, and the young people finds, such extremist groups as a resort to find wealth or make life better, which is a wrong notion. Unless our government acts in the right position, it will be extremely difficult to bring them back. So climate change, and in that aspect, within the youth sector, hasn't been not even discussed. Forget it, it's not even studied. So there is a huge vacuum of knowledge or information required in this regards, and quite often it is being undermined.
Right, thank you. So, Jill, what role should NATO be playing in this energy transition and in the push for decarbonization? I mean, we all know about national goals, and we know about the climate agreements, IPCC climate agreements, and things. What's not clear though is what role NATO should be playing in this, if anything. How can they help in this acceleration of decarbonizing our energy system?
Well, if you don't mind, I was kind of thinking about how can we help NATO at the moment.
Maybe that's much better, yes.
And so one of the questions that's very much on my mind, and I think on the mind of a lot of people, is with rising energy prices, how can the NATO, we obviously want the NATO coalition to hold together in the face of that, in the face of whatever comes. So we're supporting Ukraine without getting involved in the war, but we're obviously watching this very carefully. Now, we've talked about the transition and to renewable energy, and we've talked about decarbonisation, but of course, one of the most important things that we need to do is reduce demand for energy. And in Europe, 40% of greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. And you may have noticed that the buildings in Europe are often quite old, and they need insulating, and they need, there's a lot of things that need to happen first for us to reduce our demand. But I think the International Energy Agency, I think estimated, and don't quote me on this in case I'm wrong, but turning thermostats down by 1 degree can have an enormous impact of up to 6% of gas saved. So, we need to look at what we can do as citizens, I think, whilst we're carrying out that energy transition to renewables, about how do we reduce demand for energy. And there's been enormous successes with appliances, with reducing the amount of energy that TVs and washing machines and things use. But we also need to really look at what we're all doing, and whether, particularly in the coming year, whether we need to take that car journey, or whether there's another way of of moving around that's not going to use as much oil, whether we can, put on an extra sweater rather than having the thermostat up. And that accounts for countries which are not in the direct threat, not had the gas switched off by Gazprom, but the rest of us as well, because everything we can do to reduce our demand for energy will keep prices lower, will mean that less money goes to fight this war from those who are supplying gas and oil, and will also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there is, we're all very good at this for about 10 minutes and then we forget, or we, move on to something else. But I think over the coming years, we really do need to think about, are there practical things that all of us as citizens around the world can do to reduce our energy needs as much as possible, to allow those that are energy poor to be able to access it at reasonable prices, and to stop those who are misusing their power over resources as well by gaining huge rents, huge amounts of money from selling them. So I think we need to kind of look at those two things together, as that's the short-term action that we can all try and take, that there is no downside to, really, whilst we move to the energy transition.
Great, thanks. So I'm scrolling through some of the questions from you in the audience here. One interesting one that's come up is the person who's writing the question points out that climate change is affecting migration. Obviously, we have people who are moving because of food shortages, droughts, extreme heat, flooding, displacement. How is that changing NATO's sort of mission? And the specific question here is NATO looking into disaster relief as a means of peacekeeping? James, do you have some response to that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'd like to answer more than one question, or at least add to that, because I think it's important. But in terms of disaster relief and peacekeeping, it is quite clear that NATO forces on a national basis are going to be called upon to do that more and more. They already are. We definitely want to be able to continue to provide support to partners when they need it and ask for it. We've done that in the past in response to natural disasters, for example. I wouldn't draw a direct link between NATO and migration, though I absolutely share the view that people are going to be moving because where they live has become uninhabitable, and that's a reality we're going to have to adapt to. I'd like to come back just a little bit to the everything is bad. It's we should go to the beach, or however you framed it. And I think it's important also for us to look at the positives. And I didn't actually see that many positives till I took on this job. But as I was reading all the data, I'm like, oh my God, this is really bad. But then I actually also start to see more and more opportunities that can make a difference. And I'll give you an example, which is biofuel and synthetic fuel. So these basically don't produce carbon emissions. So I went to see Boeing and talked to our militaries, and we can, if there were enough, fly all of our aircraft on synthetic or biofuel. The technology exists, the raw materials exist. What we don't have is processing, because there's not enough of a demand signal from the commercial aviation sector or from the military aviation sector. But what the airlines say to us is, if you can add to that demand signal by pushing more into this, it'll encourage industry to start building it, and then we can feed it in. The Swedes just flew one of their fighter planes 100% on biofuel, with basically an 80% reduction in emissions. So there are technological solutions out there. If we adopt them, you don't have to invent it. It's not fusion reactors. It's there, here right now. So I say this because it's important for us to realize there are big solutions that can make a big difference. And I'll give you one more example. The US Army has decided that all of their facilities, all of their fleets are going to go to net zero by 2035. The US military is the biggest fleet owner and landowner in the United States. When they make a decision like that, it makes a statistical difference to the emissions of the United States. And we're going to be looking at the best practices of all of the allies making a compendium of them, and sharing them with everybody in June so that all of our countries can lift up to that high standard that the U.S. Army has now decided publicly to take. So I think, I'd love people to leave here recognizing all the challenges, but realizing also that there are real solutions that we can find with political will and new technologies.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think one of the difficulties of the politics of talking about the climate crisis and climate security is this sort of we all talk about the problems and the impacts, the droughts, the food shortages, all of the sea level rise, all these sorts of things, and we forget that this is a opportunity to build a much better world, right? To change things, to get ourselves off of fossil fuels, to reimagine cities in ways that are perhaps more humane, more livable. This is a great kind of transitionary sort of moment in our civilization. And so I want to ask, just open for the panel, all of you, what do you think is the best way to inspire that, especially at a moment like this, right? We're in a dark moment with the war, with the carnage that we're seeing all the time. It's easy to forget that we also have an opportunity to build a much better world, that we're fighting for a better place, not to go back to what we used to have, but trying to reimagine our world and political alliances, how we live, where we live. What would you say is the sort of one thing, the one tool that you hope people will think about and inspire people to kind of grasp that this is not a fight, it's a fight against kind of darkness, but it's also a fight for light. And I just want to hear what each of you have to say about that.
I can start with that. I think that first of all, I kind of want to start on where people can get involved, because sometimes I get asked, well, I want to do something about climate change, but where do I start? And I think the first thing is it's really important to start having conversations with your community, talking to your friends, your family, just anywhere. And then from there, I think it's really important to find your climate story. And what I mean by that is everybody is experiencing the climate crisis right now all around the world, but in different ways. And there are some people who don't even realize that it's happening. And so I think that it's important to find out what your climate story is, because from there, that's where you find your motivation. And so I have a lot of love for my hometown, and I want to protect it and keep it safe. And so I think that once you see where your inspiration is coming from, that can show you where you want to get involved in climate activism. And so I also think that it's important to focus on systemic actions as well. And so when people get involved, sometimes they just focus on recycling and transportation. But it's important to focus on systemic actions, because right now 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from 100 companies all around the world. And you aren't going to change that by just not using plastic for one day. And so when you start by talking to your politicians, organizing with other young people, protesting, so being less of an individual and joining with a collective movement of people. And so that is where you're really going to start to see more action happening. And then I also want to add that right now we have within 7 years of our carbon budget. And with that carbon budget, I think that it's an important reminder of the time that we have left, and that's a certain urgency that we have. And once you see that timeline, that will remind you constantly what we have to do, and also remind others that we have that timeline.
Great, thanks. We're running out of time. I want to hear from the other three panelists briefly on their thoughts about this. Neeshad?
Yep. I would look at the whole Russia-Ukraine invasion war is that even the climate leader was supposed to be Germany was also vulnerable. I thought Germany was doing great in terms of renewables and how they were looking at. I see all the German and other European Union countries flying into the Gulf oil-rich countries to make sure their energy budgets are ready for the upcoming days, because you've been going through the worst winter. So I think the whole idea is that no country is yet prepared self-resilient in their own climate action. This showed how vulnerable all these countries are. It opened up the hypocrisy in the climate action. They all were claiming they were doing amazing work in their home, and only for me to see almost all the foreign ministers was in the Gulf countries during the whole Ukraine war. So I think the countries has to realize that it's a security issue now coming into the picture. How vulnerable a country will get. I mean, you're bargained based on energy, like how our colleague mentioned in the call. You have to be using this as a way to make sure you are self-resilient. Your energy system is own. Nobody dictates you. I mean, that would be a big learning lesson from this war.
Thank you. That's a great point. Jill?
I kind of reiterate that really. I think during the pandemic, we heard talk about we would build back better or build, this is the wake-up call that actually climate change is here with us now. We're experiencing it, but it's also causing security problems and health problems. And there should not be another building built that requires huge amounts of energy. We ought to really learn from this, that our future depends on thinking about what we do now and look at it as a real opportunity for changing things.
Right. Okay, James, you want to wrap this up and your sort of final thoughts on this?
Sure. And I just add two thoughts. I really fully agree with what everybody has said, in particular about how you need systemic change. But let me add one more point, which I think is relevant for young people who are also involved in other areas. I think technology is going to be crucial for getting us beyond the situation we're in now. I don't really see societies making gigantic individual changes to the way we live, so we're going to need technological solutions. And in my division, we're applying artificial intelligence, big data, technological innovation, the whole technological ecosystem to climate, because that's where we're going to find big systemic changes, the way they've applied it now, for example, to fusion technology. And for the first time, you're getting more energy out of a fusion reactor than you're putting into it. So again, a hopeful technological change, which would have massive beneficial effects when it comes to climate. And the last point I would make is, we can get involved also inside the institution. So right across the street, I have a young intern who is now, she's an expert on climate. She's finishing the first draft of the NATO climate change impact assessment that NATO heads of state and government are going to look at in Madrid. So her pen is going to make a big difference to how these leaders see things. So, and if everyone watching can make that kind of a difference.
Great, thank you. All right, well, this has been pretty great, I have to say. Thank you to my panelists who have been quite inspiring. And I guess that will wrap it up. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and continued discussions there in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Well, an inspiring session indeed. Thank you both so much for being here in person. We really appreciate it, and we'll move to our next session now.